Welcome to the UAC podcast. This is Joseph Johnson with you as always, and I am joined by my new friend and author, Antonio Squillante, who is teaching and coaching in Southern California, originally from Italy. Welcome, Antonio. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Joseph.
So, for those who don't know, because this was a little bit new to me too. I knew your name. I knew that you had done some work in a couple of different places, but I didn't know anything in depth when you first reached out to me. I just kind of knew cursory information. So if you would, to our audience, kind of introduce yourself. What's your background?
Absolutely, I would love to do that. I was born as a strength and conditioning coach mostly, so on the field. I did some work in Italy with a few different professional sports. I've always been very much oriented toward like everything that allows me to experiment with strength training. So sports that require a high level of strength and power, like rugby, American football, track and field. I coached in Italy for a while. Then I moved to the States. I coached for NCAA, so mostly football. And my last experience as a coach was at the 2016 Olympic trial for track and field. So that was like, I want to say almost the apex of my career as a coach, mostly with throwers and a few sprinters. And then at that point, I realized that, yes, I gained a lot of experience in strength training. I'm very comfortable in the weight room. I'm very comfortable in the environment that we all practice in, which is pretty much NSCA-based kind of environment. I needed to like dig deeper into the science behind it. Also because I feel like I can possibly contribute more now to the future generations by using what I learned on the field and adapted and digested it with science. That's why I chose to like step back from exclusively coaching and go back more into academics. So as a graduate student doing some research now, anywhere from weightlifting to plyometric to eccentric strength training. My goal is primarily to, I know it's kind of cliche saying bridging the gap, but in reality it's more than just bridging the gap. It's digesting what we learn in the experience and make it stronger with what we gain from science. I think that's, if you were to summarize my mission or vision, that would be it.
So coming from Italy had to be a little bit different, or culture shock. And we talk about this a lot. So, and I didn't, this is not a scripted question, but what's the difference like when you come from Italy and you got some of your education? I'm assuming a lot of it there first in your training. What was that like coming to the United States?
It was an experience.
You can be negative. Go ahead.
So I'll be honest. Like when I started in this profession, what you guys were calling strength and conditioning coaching in the United States of America was completely a foreign concept in Italy. Like it wasn't even a profession developed the same way it was developed in the States. So to begin with, when I was looking for like high level evidence-based practice, even just like professional experiences, the United States has always been like my point of reference. To the point that when I took my CSCS exam with the NSCA, they didn't have a form for me to sign up from Europe. I had to call in the middle of the night, register, send all my paperwork, fly to Long Beach, take the exam, and then fly back to Italy.
Wow.
Because it wasn't even a thing. They didn't have NSCA Italy. Nothing was developed in Europe yet.
Yeah.
Now things are a little bit different, but like just to give you an idea, when I bought the first book from your publishing company, I bought it through Amazon. It took me 45 days to receive it in Italy back then.
Oh yeah. I remember that.
It's a reward.
Yeah.
What I realized that, yes, of course, I was expecting the level of professionalism in the States to be much higher, and it is. What we do here is 20 years ahead of pretty much everywhere else I've been. However, what I can proudly say is that when it comes to just general broad education in the field of sports science, there are things that I've learned in Italy through university as an undergrad student and grad student that I wish people would teach here in the States as well. So it's a little bit of both.
Yeah. We definitely got some things to learn especially on the coaching development side. We could do better for sure. And so, well, with that said, though, that's the whole point here of you being here and writing the book. So we got the new book that we haven't yet to be published, probably in the next week or two is what it looks like. Power. Tell me about it.
I'd love to do that. So the book, first of all, is a book that was born and meant for the American market. So it's very much attached to our foundation of science and practice in this country. With that being said, the goal of the book is just to try to explain the difference between what we understand as strength training, which is a very broad concept that goes anywhere from the extreme of powerlifting and weightlifting to the domain of fitness and rehab. So it's a very broad concept. To take what's good about strength training, but to adapt it to sports performance. Because after working for so many years in the field, training a jumper, training a soccer player, training a throwers, yes, you need strength training, but it's not the strength training that you would do with a weightlifter. It's not the strength training that you would do with a powerlifter. It's not the same strength training that you would do with a rugby player. Everything is different. So the goal of the book is to be able to put into an understandable manner the difference between general strength training and strength training for sport. And the reason why I decided to call it power is because, as a matter of fact, when we work with athletes, it's not about how strong they are. It's not about how much they lift. It's about how powerful they can really be. And strength becomes just one member of the equation. It's not just all about strength. There are many more things you have to develop in an athlete. And ultimately, it's the power output that determines how good an athlete actually is. So that's why the reason the name came out as power too, because that's the main focus of what I want to concentrate on.
So you broke it down into multiple areas, and there's been and one of the areas that I was originally kind of thinking when you brought the idea to me was the velocity-based training, and
Yes.
That was something that Dr. Brian Mann is kind of elucidated a little bit more, and it was a concept actually that had originated in the Soviet Union quite a ways back.
Oh yeah.
If you would give me a history on that, number one, how did that, the whole idea of the velocity-based training, because it was funny because when Brian wrote the book, it was fairly unknown here outside of the translated text from, I think it was Roman, if I'm correct.
Yep.
What's the history on that, on the development of power? And kind of I know that there was a time where the Russians were looking at strength, too, 60s, 70s. And then somewhere in the 70s, I believe, if I'm right, you correct me if I'm wrong, they started to look at that. They said, we got to, that's not the be all to end all. There's more to this, and we've got to do something different. Can you give me a history on that?
Yeah. So I can almost certainly say that the first paper I've ever found to make a reference to velocity-based training was published in Bulgaria in 1968.
Okay. Wow.
And it was done to use, as weird as it sounds, we think that's a brand new thing. It's not. To use weightlifting movements such as the snatch or the clean and jerk in the training of discus throwers. And the whole reason why velocity-based came to be is because as science evolved, and it evolved quite a lot due to the Soviet Union and the research they invested in, they realized that, in all honesty, adaptation at the neuromuscular level is not really load dependent, but speed dependent. So that was a concept that Carmelo Bosco quite often mentioned. You can't really name strength if you don't name what kind of speed you're moving at. They go hand in hand. It's something that we learned from the heel curve, force velocity curve, all the way to the work that Margaria did, Viro did, Bosco did, Comey, plenty of researchers, so that they were able to define, okay, strength matters and the overload matters because that's what creates adaptation. However, if you don't move the right load at the right speed, the adaptation you're going to get is not going to carry on into a better athletic performance. Just to give you the short version of it. I think that we did well for a while, learning more about this relationship between load and velocity. However, we got to a point, and that's kind of a trend of the industry, has always been that way, where like it became all about velocity-based training. If you don't measure your speed,
Right.
if you're not programming based on velocity-based training, you're not doing anything. In reality,
Right.
doing traditional strength training, or what is known as prescription-based training, where you prescribe the load and not the speed, or doing velocity-based training, where you prescribe the speed and the load becomes secondary, they're just far extremes of two approaches that should be used together. You should be able to control the weight, you should be able to control the speed, and make them as coherent as possible with the level of adaptation you want to achieve. And that's something that I felt quite comfortable covering in the book because, honestly, I use velocity-based training pretty much on everything I do. But that does not mean that I always exclusively prescribe speed. I either use speed to prescribe the load or vice versa, but I always monitor both to make sure that adaptation happens in a very specific manner.
And one thing that I kind of paid attention to myself, and I'm just going to throw maybe some weird questions at you, is that like what you said, some things are more strength based, and then some things are more, obviously speed based. So if you looked at, Olympic weightlifter, the speed's involved, but strength is a huge part. Powerlifting, it's only strength. And then if you look at other sports where, let's say like maybe even like soccer, for example, there's a certain amount of quickness, which is not necessarily even speed or power. It's kind of lower down on that scale. How do you differentiate a little bit there when you're looking at, and I'm thinking right now of like basketball where, they really need to be explosive in the first one or two steps, really. And that's really going to be the key, component. How do you look at that? Like, uh, adjusting speeds accordingly to what the objective is, or do you juggle speeds throughout the year? Does that make sense?
Totally, that's a great question, and that's what I actually try to do when writing this book. So, see, like there are way many different approaches that someone can take to analyze sport, collect data, and use them to program strength training. However, and I'm not gonna say that's the best way to go, but my way to go about it, also because it's my training and my research area, is mostly biomechanics. And when you look at biomechanics of the movement, there are two things that come in mind: the skill involved, which in sport can vary. Like you can go from like running, sprinting, changing direction, jumping, whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
But each skill comes with a certain mechanical profile. And in mechanics, it comes down to be a trade-off between the time you have available to create force and the amount of force you need, which when we look at biomechanics, we're looking at ground reaction force and ground contact time. So those are the two main variables that will tell you for sure how much strength your athlete needs and how much speed they also need to generate to be able to be explosive. So the approach that comes out of this book, and I try to make it so that it's not too heavily on biomechanics because I want to be able to communicate with people that don't have a strong background in biomechanics. But I'm trained as a scientist, so I'm trained to be as objective as possible. And biomechanics gives you an objective approach to digest the diversity in sport because sports are so many and so different. But then when you break them down to their fundamental skills and the biomechanics of that skill, you get numbers that you can use as a set point to make your educated decisions about, okay, how much strength do they need? How much time do we have to spend in developing just sheer strength? How much power they need? What kind of speed they need? Everything comes together when you start looking at sport in terms of biomechanics. And again, that's my opinion. Someone else might go by a more like muscle physiology approach, and that works as well. My personal opinion is mostly based on biomechanics.
It's funny that you say that because that's been the same way that I was trained. Dr. Yes has been my mentor for 26 years. And in truth, like even with some of the other Russian scientists, they all, transfer of training kind of was addressing that issue to whatever degree, saying, look, you can be strong in all these lifts and still suck at the shot put or the hammer throw. And he had a lot of examples of that. I remember he told me personally that they had a shot putter who could bench press 700 pounds, but he was like 4 or 5 meters off from being able to compete at the world class level. So that tells you obviously then strength, and that's a strength, more of a strength dominant sport. And even then it was, it got carried away too much, I guess. So the key is being able to execute or display that high level of power on a specific skill.
Yep.
That's needed. So if you talk to like a baseball player who's batting, the speed of the bat is a rate limiting factor for how hard he's going to hit the ball.
Yep.
And just because you can bench press a lot does not mean that you can move the bat fast.
No, at all.
And then there's a point where it actually would have a negative correlation. Correct.
Correct. I was definitely very lucky to, first of all, being exposed to the Russian approach. Because the first time, like in Italy, you start university when you're 18, 19-ish by the time you graduate from high school. And I started studying as a biology major. Like I wanted to go into biology before I changed to sports science. But I did want to go into biology with the goal of understanding muscle mechanics, and be able to apply that to sport. So my mom, she retired now, but she was a French teacher, so she was into education. So the day I applied to school, she took me to a local bookstore, and she offered to buy like one book that could lead me to my future career in sports science. And the book I picked was a book by Verchosansky.
Oh, no kidding.
Published in 1987, so the year I was born, and that was like early 2000. But I got that in printing as my very first step into this profession. That's where it kind of shaped my way of thinking about things.
Yeah.
And I realized that, yes, it comes down to a question of skills. Skills can be very much sport specific, but if you look at the like ontology of like movement development, skills go always back to fundamental skills, like running, jumping, throwing. There might be different variations, different combinations, but the way our body copes with mechanical load is always going to be the same. So once you can set a frame of reference that looks at the commonality between things and then branches out into specific application, that's the best, in my opinion, that's the best way to go. And biomechanics allows you to do that.
So, and like I said, this has been exactly the stuff that I was raised on myself. And I'm at the end of 26 years now, I think, with Dr. Yes's working in the field. And he always emphasized to me that, the only thing that matters is how this benefits him as an athlete on the field. If he doesn't run faster, he doesn't hit harder, doesn't kick further, whatever the case may be, none of it matters. None of the training. So you've got to look at the skill and then develop exercises that will start to duplicate the skill. Now, that doesn't mean that it's exclusively that, obviously, but that's the fine point at the end. So in the beginning, anything you do, as we both know, anything you do works. Yeah. General exercise doesn't matter. But as you get further and further along, it needs to get a little more specific. And ultimately, at the high level, it needs to get very specific. And in fact, like Dr. Bondarchuk would say that, with his throwers, the heavier and lighter implement that's the main exercises. Yep. That's the ones that are the most important at that high level. So you're trying to develop, having that biomechanical background, you're developing exercises that allow that. Now, the other side, or the other side to the coin, is then you also have to develop the muscular contraction correctly.
Yes.
That's the other part. So tell me how you do, like if you're developing exercises for particular movements, we already know we're trying to duplicate some of the actions in parts and then sometimes in whole. Like a hammer throw, it's hard to do that in a part. You have to do the whole, it's really hard to do that. Other times, like with maybe like baseball batting, sometimes it's in parts because there's portions of it that are broken up into different joint actions. How do you fuse that together and put together, the specificity of biomechanics along with the specificity of contraction, or for lack of a better word, muscular regime that Yuri would call that?
That's a great question. I think, to give you the short answer before we expand the concept, I think the answer truly is periodization. That's how you approach training on the long term. Mm-hmm. And in the book, we covered the concept of conjugate method, which is something that in more weight than I.
What separates an elite, world-class athlete from everyone else? Their genes make them quicker, react faster, and more explosive. What if there was a way to, in a sense, turn on those elite athlete genes in the average person? Recent advances in genomic research and sports nutrition have proven this is now possible. Introducing Milesync by Nootromic Sport Nutrition. Multiple studies show it increases quickness, explosiveness, and strength. In most cases, your vertical increases by at least 1 inch an hour after it's taken. Through a proprietary blend of ingredients, Milesync in effect flips the switch on those genes that make you jump higher, run faster, and lift heavier weights. Here are several Milesync testimonials.
This is Daniel Stokes. He's a sprinter. What was your best time before we started training this season with Milesync?
21.5.
And what's your best time as of today?
20.7.
Could you explain to us what the fast twitch muscle supplements done for you, Milesync?
It made me more explosive. It helped with my reaction time off the ground, bring my knees up quicker, and I continually progress.
This is Matt Tomey, head strength and conditioning coach for football and men's basketball at Michigan Tech. If you haven't tried Nootromic Sport Nutrition's supplement Milesync yet, you're definitely missing out. I've had athletes here try the supplement and really enjoy the benefits, including an immediate improvement in vertical jump of about 1 inch. Milesync really stands out with its ability to improve power output, speed, reaction time, even potentially quick decision making. If you haven't checked out this unique supplement yet, go ahead and pick up a bottle of Milesync and give it a shot and just see for yourself.
Here is lead formulator Rick Brewer's brief explanation of Milesync.
Milesync evolved out of the neuroproteomic research we conducted starting back in 2005 to nutritionally boost the speed strength traits of well-trained athletes. These speed strength traits could include things like reaction time, starting power, maximal speed, quickness and agility, and also fine motor skills. Double-blind placebo studies as well as many outcome studies have been conducted on well-trained athletes from many sports and of many ages. The results of this research have shown a sizable boost in muscle contractions as well as the synchronization of these muscle contractions during speed strength activities.
Has become familiar recently in the world of powerlifting. Like, I think that what really got the name out there, at least the American community.
Yeah.
But the way we think conjugate method in powerlifting is a very simple sport or activity where like you train and you compete with a bar. Yeah. So the skill that you use to train are the same skills that you use in competition. And weightlifting is very similar to some extent. More complex, but very similar. In reality, so what you do there, you just combine dynamic effort method, max effort method, some work on hypertrophy, and it's pretty simple. But in reality, if we look back at the conjugate method, which was invented a long time ago and was very much used by Verchosansky and many of the Bulgarian system was developed on the conjugate method. What you're actually conjugating, which means combining together, is skill and muscular conditioning. So you are at the same time, like you said, conditioning your muscles to create the amount of strength and power you need for your sport while you are supporting the learning and mastering of skills. So I think it all comes down to answer your question, you can't really translate every single skill into a propedeutic movement in the weight room. There are some skills that you just have to practice on the field, and there are some physical qualities that you can develop in the weight room. But as long as you do them in a conjugate manner, where the physical development is supportive to a better expression of sport-specific skill, that's where you really maximize the results, and that's where it all should be.
So this has always been my thought on this, and I'd like to hear like your how you look at that, because I think this would be interesting. So the way I've looked at it is, in the younger stages, you're doing some general movements, light intensity, and just allowing them to get a little stronger. And then as they get further along, we'll start to use some specific methods, but they're more they're specific, but they're done for teaching. So the intensity is so light; it's just to kind of master that motor skill, that motor ability, right, and to ingrain the neuromuscular pathway for that particular skill. And then as time goes on, as you get more specific there, then you start to look at varieties of muscular contraction or muscular regime. So we'll go, okay, at the beginning it's strength and it's light intensity, and then the intensity starts to kind of come up. And then we might look at it from, let's do it faster. Maybe we're doing it, and then ultimately we're doing it with the stretch shortening cycle on that specific movement. Is that how you see that, like how that evolves from one end of the spectrum to the other, or lighter, heavier and lighter, if it's an implement, or maybe like with team sports, maybe like with weighted shorts, weighted clothing? That's the way I've kind of always looked at that. How do you look at that?
I would strongly agree, to be honest. I think if you look at the continuum of a development of an athlete, regardless of the age you start, you need to start by laying the foundations of just body literacy and like physical development, strengthen your muscles, strengthen your joints. And at that point, nothing can really be specific. You just need to incorporate as much as you possibly can to develop as much as you possibly can. Then as you further progress toward more like a skill-based training, that everything becomes a function of what you need to achieve in sport. So everything becomes more specific to some extent. And then you get to the point where your skill is very well developed and you kind of go back to the basics, but at this point you pick them apart and you choose only what you need. And that's where you go and implement maybe just eccentric muscle training because all you want to develop is more muscle tendon stiffness. Or maybe you choose more velocity-based training because all you care about is the stretch shortening cycle. So it's kind of a U-shape where you go like everything is very general. Then you go to something that is more specific where you're actually building the skill and the physical development that an athlete need. And then you go back to like where everything is back to be general but picked apart. And you really focus on those little things that you need for your particular sport.
Yeah. So the way that we did some work, Dr. Estes and I did some work with a professional basketball player about 17, 18 years ago. And we that's exactly what we started doing. We started looking at every action that he took on the court to see if we could duplicate them with different exercises. So Dr. Estes start using exercises, even plyometric exercises that duplicated a specific action. We were still using the depth jump as a center of the exercises, but we also used a collection of other exercises that use the stretch shortening cycle on a specific skill. And then we also had developed heavier and lighter basketballs, so with a few ounce differentials, and slight enough so that the biomechanics didn't change, the technique didn't change in the actions. So then the basketball player could use different ball handling movements and move the ball through faster. As a consequence. So that was kind of the continuum. We kept going towards that, and it sounds to me kind of like what you're talking about. Same idea, just continually. And go back to the first question is like, and Brian Mann has said this to me too, like when you first started with power training or velocity training, you might just use kind of a general 60% rule, right? And just because it doesn't matter, because it's going to work with everybody, right? And then as you get further along, maybe that if he's, a basketball player, for example, maybe he might get down to 40-30% because that might mimic more what he needs. Am I right?
Absolutely.
Right with that?
I agree 100%.
So sequentially, we know that strength needs to be developed for sure. Does it need to be beat to death the way that we do it in the United States? I would assume you'd say no. Correct?
No, correct.
How do you know? Because I get this question all the time. How do you know when an athlete, how do you know, personally from your experience, how do you approach he's strong enough to start using power training?
That's a very good question. I do have a bit of a general guideline or approach to it. First and foremost, I always look at technique, even before strength, because I've noticed that an athlete can be physically, so to speak, ready to embrace more intense training, because maybe his squat or her squat is up to where it's supposed to be, or whatever parameter used to decide that, but the technique might not be there. So first of all, I always look at skill development, how comfortable an athlete is in the weight room, and anything that comes with it. However, my point of reference is always, first and foremost, how strong an athlete is in the fundamental lift. So pretty much the back squat is my go-to for like every sort of assessment. So for an elite level athlete, and for elite level, I mean any athlete after 18, 19 years old, 2 times body weight in the squat is pretty much a gold standard to let them know that physically they have enough strength to be able to tolerate power training. But then again, it might come down to, yes, they're strong enough, but if you put them through a training program that stresses more the stress shortening cycle, they might not even be able to handle that because they're not quick enough to handle it. So I always integrate squatting and jumping abilities, and I read them at the same time to see where the gap is and where they are. And only when they kind of merge together and you can tell they're pretty much at the same level compared to like normative data or standard data, then when it becomes, okay, now they're ready for more advanced training.
So how do you handle, let's say you have an athlete and they're younger, but they're strong enough, theoretically. And you find out that because a lot of people said, well, with higher level athletes, 60% almost always equated to, let's say, 0.8 meters per second, like right in that ballpark. What I found with younger athletes is that 0.8 meters per second typically was lighter. It was like 50%, maybe a little lighter than that even. Why is that?
Well, there are many, many different reasons why. Is that first and foremost, there are some biomechanical aspects of the musculoskeletal system that are different between individuals. And I'm thinking about like angle of pennation, insertion of the tendons, like that might change and might increase variety between subjects. But also it comes down to a lot of training age. Like being able to move a weight at a certain speed is so to speak, is a skill that you have to acquire. You have to train in a certain way to be able to expect a certain outcome. So it makes a lot of difference if you're working with an athlete that is used to train at a certain velocity and you're working with an athlete that is not. So if you don't test, assess, and retest, there's no way you will ever know what's the right way for the right speed. So it comes down to like designing the right training program for the right athlete because everyone is different.
Would you initially, let's say it's the very first time you're trying velocity type of training, power training with an athlete, would you adjust it for the speed more than for the percentage?
Yeah, so the way I go about it personally is just let's say that I've never done any velocity-based training with anyone, so it will be the first time. I put just an accelerometer on the bar and I do a normal test where I try to keep it as specific as possible for the movement. So if I'm entering a new program, I'll probably prescribe only one exercise for velocity-based training and get time to get used to it. So let's say the back squat, just for instance. Before the program starts, I do a testing session when I do incremental loads from 20 to 80% of 1 rep max. Mm-hmm. And when I give the athlete a few reps to be able to get up to speed, and I measure that speed. And then let's say that, I'm just throwing numbers out there, but let's say that for the program, I intend to use a speed of 0.8 meter per second. And in the test, I realized that the closest percentage is 70%. I will start that athlete at 70%, and I will not change that weight until set after set, rep after rep, that athlete can move the weight at 1.1 meter per second. And then at that point, I will start using more a predictive model to like decide what to do. But at the beginning, I will start with whatever the athlete is capable of doing and whatever force velocity profile he has or she has in one particular lift, and then take it from there and evolve alongside with the athlete.
So in the beginning, speed trumps the percentage in a general sense.
Absolutely.
So this is a way people can do this. Because I've heard, I know that in some places, some coaches have used velocity-based training at early ages, in, I would say, early teenage years. I've seen that, and I always wondered about, like, how did they determine, how do you know that this athlete, he's younger? How do you know that he can move the load that fast? I always wondered about that. So I thank you for answering. That was actually a question I had personally. Which I always throw my own little questions in here too, because I want to know.
You should.
I got things I want to know too. So with all the material that's out there, we've seen different things that have been written on velocity. Dr. Mann's written a great book, and we post that, and he's getting ready to do a new edition of it. You hear a lot of articles on it. You see a lot of talk. What's different about this book right here, Power, in the collection of publications already? What are we bringing to the table that's new?
That's a great question. I think what I've tried to do personally is, so like, this is my opinion again. It's not like against anyone or anything that's done in the industry. If I put myself, I do a lot of teaching for standard college, but also for the NSCA. And I realized that if I put myself in the shoes of a new practitioner, a new strength and conditioning coach, where like I have a solid foundation of understanding of physiology, bioenergetics. I've learned everything in school, but now I need to learn how to apply it. Mm-hmm. If I look at what is done on the field, everyone is so desperate to look different and be fancy and be known for something in particular.
Yeah.
And they just lose track of the basics and the fundamental things that you have to get in place before you can get fancy. Then once you gain the skill, once you become like a seasoned practitioner, do whatever you want. It becomes an art at that point because you have the science down to the T. So you know exactly what you're doing. But the beginning, I think what's missing, it's a book. And I hope this book can be that book that just shows you what's good and what always works with different athletes and what you can rely on based on science. So this is what we learn. This is what you can start from, that you can be as fancy as you want. Take it from there and develop whatever style or philosophy of training you want. But this is the foundation, and that's what works, because as work for me as a practitioner, but also works in science to back it up. So I would say it's probably, I hope it to be, I hope it's going to be like one of those fundamental books that you use to go back and reference to, but that gives you an idea of like where you should start to be like spot on with what an athlete needs. And then from that point on, take it on and just develop whatever technique or whatever skill or whatever fancy way of training you wish. But at least you get the foundation covered.
And so the idea at the end is that for you to know what the tools are in your toolbox that are effective tools. And then, like you said, it becomes an art then, because you're trying to apply those tools to a specific situation to elicit a specific response or outcome. And that's not always easy, as you know, and because you're trying to figure out this individual athlete who doesn't maybe fit the norm. Maybe he's an outlier. Maybe there's something different with them. I've had athletes who are so sensitive to volume, I have to cut it way back. And then I have athletes who are sensitive to something else, and you have to kind of figure out how they respond, and you learn. With this book, I wanted to, while we're talking about the tools, so basically, I'm looking right now at the book with the chapters. We looked at the mechanics of power in sport. We're looking at the maximum effort method. Yeah. And this is kind of, a lot of people are familiar with that idea from Louis Simmons, I think, max effort, because he's kind of been the one that popularized that, the repeated effort method. And by the way, this was also in Zatsiorski's book, 95. I think.
Absolutely, that's the foundation of strength training.
Yeah, that was like the one of the first books on that subject. Repeated effort method, which definitely was his. And then you go into velocity-based training later in the book, and then you also cover eccentric training, which is something I want to ask you about, and then functional hypertrophy, which is also interesting. And I think one that is misunderstood, I think, in the United States, maybe as much as other stuff. I mean, it's hard to find which one's the most misunderstood, because a lot of them are. But that's definitely misunderstood, because getting bigger for the sake of getting bigger can be counterproductive.
It is.
And we see this, like if you see it like in like football, I guess would be a good example. And so, well, you got to get weight on him. But there's different methods of getting weight on them. You know, a bodybuilding approach will certainly put weight on. Now, is it usable? Are they able to still move? Because a lot of people presume that, okay, if we gain weight, then where it's a trade-off in his speed or his explosiveness, right? But you can have both, and there's a way to do that. And it's mainly with the methods of training and kind of staying away from bodybuilding. So I definitely want to come back to that with you, because I think that's going to be interesting in a future podcast. And then also the power of the metric of power development, training volume for power development, which is also important. Explaining the conjugate method, which is another one that I want to come back to in another podcast, because I think this one's really misunderstood. I hear conjugate method for powerlifting. Because I hear powerlifters talk about conjugate method. It doesn't seem to apply to me, but maybe I'm out in left field there. Yeah. Okay. Good. I'm glad to hear that. And then the periodization ideas here, which is something else that I think is going to be interesting for people with velocity, because or power training, because that one hasn't been covered very well. Like, what is the periodization model? What would that look like, right? Yeah. Anatoly Bondarchuk has done a lot with the development of power as well, and his periodization models look totally different than a lot of other people's periodization models. Matter of fact, I've heard some scientists tell me it's not even periodization what he's doing. I'm not really sure what he's doing.
Yeah.
But you know, his track record speaks for itself. And he's juggling a lot of these power methods in a periodized way. And that's going to be coming out in his book actually next year that we'll do as well. I wanted to talk to you about eccentric training real quickly, just as we give this an overview, because that's one that gets a little bit of talk. A lot of people don't really understand it very well. And to be honest with you, it's probably one of the methods that it's not that I've used the least. I've used eccentric training. A super maximal eccentric training is that's a really powerful method. So you don't really run into a lot of situations where it makes as much sense, you know, and you got to be kind of careful with it. Talk about that, if you would, just briefly about the value of the eccentric training in the cycles, and where you apply it at, like, you know, what time of year and at what place in the athlete's career.
Yeah, that's a great question. First and foremost, I would like to so I see that the majority of misunderstanding about eccentric training comes from something as simple as the definition of what eccentric training really is. And that's pretty common even in the literature. There are articles that just refer to eccentric training, but they don't specify what kind of eccentric training are we looking at. The pure eccentric training, by definition, and that's just muscle physiology and mechanics, is not my definition. It's a training that is done with a load that exceeds your warrior max. It's a load that you can only lower down. You can overcome concentrically. That's the real eccentric training. What we got accustomed to, because it's easier, because it's using physical therapy, rehab, because it's using in bodybuilding, is the sub-maximal eccentric training, which is nothing but time under tension. It's a movement that you can control, where you can control the concentric, you can control the eccentric, and it's done for one reason only, to get muscles bigger. It's an hypertrophy kind of work, which does not necessarily result in muscles that are stronger or more powerful. Supramaximal eccentric training results in a level of adaptation that is much more functional. What you develop is not just a more active CNS that is going to recruit more fast twitch motor units and faster, but you also develop one thing that is always overlooked in, I want to say 90% of the strength and conditioning programs around the world, which is muscle tendon stiffness. Stiffness is not a bad thing. Active stiffness is something that muscles need to be able to store elastic energy and use it. The more you train that mechanism in the muscle at the tissue level, the more functional your muscle will be in a stretch shortening cycle. And that's what happens with supramaximal eccentric training. You're teaching your muscles how to store energy where they're lengthening, so that when you apply that to a more ballistic, explosive movement, your muscles know exactly what to do and what to do with that energy. So it is a very tough way of training. It's very taxing on the neuromuscular system. It's very taxing on the athletes. It results in lots of DOMs. Like, it takes you out from a weight room for at least 48 hours if you do that correctly. And that's why,
at least probably, yeah.
And that's why very few athletes can handle that, and they can only handle that in the off season. But it's something that, if it's done correctly, has the ability to change the force velocity profile of an athlete out and of itself, just by adding eccentric training well done with weights above 1 rep max.
So and I don't want to get too deep into the weeds on it, because I think this is partly a good part of another podcast. But when you start with that, do you start low as you go super maximal, like just over 100%? Because I know it can go up to 140%. I'm assuming you don't go right to 140%, but I don't know. How do you look at that? How do you ease that in? Like, how do you introduce that into an athlete's training?
It's all part of a continuum. So my gold standard is the ideal load to start any form of strength training is about 80%. That's where you will, like, if you look at Carmelo Bosco, it says that's the minimum you have to use. It might be questionable. Maybe you can go down to 70, 75 if you're explosive, 60. But as a ballpark, 80% is kind of the gold standard. So I usually start by, first of all, progressing an athlete to like a general linear approach where you slowly increase the intensity and decrease the volume as you approach the 80%. Then once you get to 80%, I start playing around with time under tension. So I do some training where it's more like 2 seconds down, 1 second pause, explode straight up. And one where I start to stretch the eccentric. I start to go to like 4 seconds, 6 seconds, 8 seconds. Usually every time an athlete is capable of handling 80% at about 6 to 8 second eccentric, I bump it up by 10%. So I go up to 90% and I start building again 4 seconds, 6 seconds, 8 seconds. Once I get to that, I bump it up to 100%. And once an athlete gets to be able to manage 100% of load for 2-3 reps, for 2-3 sets with 6 second eccentric, at that point on, I add the supramaximal aspect of it.
So it's a gradual kind of introduction
and progression.
Because, and correct me if I'm wrong, because this is the way we look at most everything, is that you want to use the slightest change or slightest increase to elicit the response as possible, because you can't ever come back to that again. So if I went right to 140%, it's going to be hard to kind of challenge that again in the same way. And it might not even be that as effective if we would have started like using the method that you just explained. You could ruin the athlete. I don't want to say ruin, but like Dr. Bondarchuk says, if you use a method that's intense too early, he says you can't come back from it because the nervous system takes on an imprint that can't be undone. And so now you've kind of ruined that athlete's potential, if you will.
I agree.
So that's kind of basically what you're articulating to me, is start low and kind of ease your way into it. And then eventually you might get to 140, but that's going to be a while. It's not going to be right off of the jump. That makes sense. I want to give you one other real quick one, because this one comes up too. It doesn't get talked about as much, but using altitude landings, at higher heights than what you would normally do a depth jump with. What's the difference? Obviously, I know the contraction's much faster, and there's an eccentric load there to keep you from collapsing.
Yeah.
What's different though in the practical sense of how you would use that, or would you use it?
It's a great question, and I would probably answer in a very simple manner. I hope it's not disappointing. I think if you were to compare a supramaximal eccentric done with a back squat, okay, and a supramaximal, so to speak, supramaximal landing, so falling from a height that is much higher that you can jump off, there's a different level of perturbation of the system. That the easiest way for me to explain that is that squatting is a close kill where everything is very much predictable. The athletes know the path. Everything is set in stone. You just have to execute. Whereas when you're falling from a box, every single attempt is different. There's more perturbation. There's more coordination needed between the two limbs. So it's, to some extent, is much more sport specific. So I love that kind of eccentric training for athletes, and I do that a lot too. I do every variations from like starting from the ground and landing on a tall box to decrease the eccentric amortization, to the opposite, where you fall from a very tall box and all you want to do is just stop yourself in an athletic position. I think it's just much more functional, and it can lead to a better carryover to like speed, power, and agility training than just squatting would do.
So it's kind of like a different tool, maybe used in a similar phase or maybe used sequentially, I would suppose, with both of them. And correct me if I'm wrong, both of them would be something that you would probably do preceding the shock method cycles there, because that will amplify, or I shouldn't say amplify, accentuate the athlete's ability to, in the amortization phase of a plyometric exercise. So now he's going to be able to get up off the ground quicker on a depth jump or whatever the case may be. So that's going to be an important, and it's important in two different ways in the plyometric, and also like in sports where change of pace and change of speed are important, or being able to stop on a dime, that eccentric is also going to play a very important role. I mean, that's what it is, right? So that altitude drop with the super maximal eccentric is going to be very important in the athlete's ability to go one direction really fast and stop on a dime, and hopefully the other person keeps going. That's kind of the idea. So yeah, those are kind of somewhat misunderstood ideas. The eccentric idea, I think, is misunderstood to some degree, and then the application thereof, I think, is probably even more misunderstood as to what its value is exactly and how to implement it. And at the right stages with the right athlete. That's just something that I gather as I listen, read other people, and talk to them. You can kind of see that it's either totally missing from the training, or if it's in there, it's not applied as well as it probably could be. Not as wisely, I think. Well, I learned a couple things here today, so I like this. We got quite a few chapters to go over, and you and I are going to go over them together on more podcasts. But I wanted to just kind of give people an idea of what we're doing here. So the idea of the book, and I want you to correct me after I'm done here with this, but the idea of the book was to look at all of the concepts in power, not just in the specific context of velocity training. That's an enormous part, but these other topics that you're all play into that. This is the idea of actually developing power, not power training. Am I right? Like, so we're looking at you being able to exhibit power, not just necessarily the power training, all the things that go into it, right? Because there's other factors besides just the power training, things that complement or have synergy with your velocity training. Well, like it'd be jump training or, plyometrics, things like this. They're all synergistic, and then they just all have to be applied at the right time, in the right sequence, in the right volume, very, very specific to get that result that you want. For the athlete or the coach who's wanting to develop those qualities, what's the book giving them?
So it's a great question. And I'm sorry if I bring back the answer to, again, physics or biomechanics, but
no,
the
please.
Biggest picture. So power is the product of force time velocity, but we're not dealing with a machine. We're not dealing with an engine. We're dealing with the human body, and force involves the physiology of muscle contraction. So in the word force or strength comes hypertrophy or functional hypertrophy, comes muscle tendon stiffness. In the word velocity comes intramuscular coordination, intermuscular coordination. So the more you peel these layers apart, the more you realize power is the outcome, but what matters is the recipe that brings you there. And the recipe is made by many ingredients, and they all have to come together. If you do too much strength, power is not going to come out right. If you do not enough velocity, power is not going to come out. If you only do barbell training and you don't do plyometrics, it's not going to come out right. You have to be able to combine in a coordinated manner all these different tools, use them within the domain of periodization and create the perfect recipe for power. And that's what I hope the book is gonna deliver.
That's what I like about it, because I like the idea that, because I think people sometimes can get off onto one topic, like if you in velocity training, which is, it's obviously it's a very critical tool, but then the next thing you know, that's all somebody's doing. It's just that, and that would be an error. It's good to look at that and take a deep look at it, like in the upcoming book with Dr. Mann. Take a deep look at that and understanding all the underpinnings there. But then also kind of understand, I think this is kind of where your book kind of takes it, is like, okay, that's a tool. Now let's look at the interaction of that tool with the other ones. It's almost like making a recipe. I'm looking at how these ingredients mix with each other and how they fit together, and then how you can elicit that ultimate response that you wanted, which was, you know, the end goal of that technique. I want to say technique, or that skill being exhibited more powerfully. Not just chasing just a number in the weight room on a speed or what. Not that that's not important. It is important. It's very important. But that may not be the only thing that allows you to exhibit your skill in the most explosive, powerful manner. It's going to play a role. And the way that I've described sometimes with specialized movements and in the techniques is that there's kind of a conduit. And it's wider. If we understand all of the different things, then we can really get that power out on the other end. But it can be blocked if we don't, put it onto the skill. If we don't develop, enough strength in advance. The conduit gets wider the more that we've developed all the other components. Is that right?
100%. And as a matter of fact, when you were listing the different topics in the book, you mentioned the chapters on the metric of power development. That chapter alone is the byproduct of more than 15 years of programming for athletes. That is the real recipe. That's where you bring everything together. Because what makes a recipe unique is not the ingredients alone, it's the combination of the ingredients in the right quantity. Right. Because you can use the same ingredients to do two different kinds of dishes. It's just how you combine them in what quantity. And that's what the metric is. Like, how much of each do you need to elicit the best interaction for your goal? And that's the book that took the most out of me. That's where I started from to develop the book. And then I attached everything else to make sure that everything makes sense.
I think that characterizes the book perfectly. That this is somewhat more of an ingredient recipe book on how to use the different ingredients that we know to develop the improvement in the skill that we're looking for, empowering that. So that is the way to kind of characterize that the best, I think. And so this is going to be valuable for everybody. I'm excited about doing it. I'm glad that we took it on, and I'm glad that we have you to ask more questions. So we're going to get together soon. We're going to do several more podcasts. I'm going to ask you a ton more questions. I already went way over here running my mouth, but I've enjoyed it, and hopefully everyone else too. So thank you so much, Antonio. Looking forward to the book being released here in the next week or so, hopefully by the first of the year. And we're going to get together soon.
Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Thank you.